The new movie, The Mandalorian and Grogu, is just around the corner, and with 4 different seasons to know before watching it, you might not remember everything, or maybe you've just never seen it. So, here's everything you need to know before watching the movie. Grogu's beginning. To be as prepared as possible for the movie, we need to start at the very beginning. And I mean, the very beginning. The main 2 characters in the film are of course the Mandalorian named Djarin as well as Grogu. Grogu, however, was born in the year 41 BBY, which, to give you an idea, is about 9 years before the events of the Phantom Menace. So yeah, he's a lot older than he looks. By the time of the new movie, he's just about 53 years old, but because of his species, he develops a lot slower than, let's say, a human. Grogu is the same species as Yoda, but the species name has never been revealed as George Lucas always kept this a secret, so that's why many call him Baby Yoda. However, here's what we do know. While there's no confirmation that Grogu is Yoda's son or even related to him, we do know that Grogu was raised in the Jedi Temple growing up. He spent about 22 years there until we eventually reached the events of Revenge of the Sith. Anakin fell to the dark side, Palpatine rose to power, and Order 66 was commanded, which killed thousands of Jedi across the galaxy. Now unfortunately, Grogu was also attacked during Order 66 and was at the Jedi Temple when everything went down. It was there where he saw many of his fellow Jedi die right before his eyes, but luckily he was rescued by a Jedi Master named Kelleran Beck. Kelleran clearly knew how valuable Grogu was, so he escaped with him and they were able to leave the planet together. If it weren't for that, Grogu probably would have been killed, but luckily he made it out alive. Now from there, we don't know much, but we do know that Grogu was forced to go into hiding for many years. He remained in hiding for decades, and as a result, he lost many of his memories, including how to use the Force, mainly because he had to keep himself hidden. During that time, the Jedi were seen as enemies to the galaxy, and Grogu would have been hunted if anybody knew of his existence. Now that's what we know about Grogu's story, but now let's talk about Din Djarin. His early years, though, are a bit darker than you might think. Din Djarin's beginning. Din was born during the Clone Wars on the planet Akvatina. On that planet, he was born into a village, but one day, his village was attacked by separatist droids during the war. Unfortunately, these droids killed most of his people, including his own parents, but before their death, they hid Din that way he could live. Luckily in time though, a group called Death Watch eventually swept in and rescued Din, driving and killing all the droids off. Now, if you don't know who Death Watch is, or maybe just forgot, I got you. Back during the Clone Wars, there was a Duchess named Satine Kryze who ruled over Mandalore with a pacifist ideology, and she didn't believe in war or fighting. The problem is, this went against Mandalorian culture, so this eventually led to the formation of a group known as Death Watch. Death Watch was a group of Mandalorians that went against Satine's rule and tried doing everything in their power to bring back the old Mandalorian warrior ways. At points during the Clone Wars, they had some success, but became irrelevant once the Empire rose to power. So, going back, after Death Watch rescued Din, he was brought into the group and was taken to the planet of Concordia. From that day on, he grew up there and was trained under Death Watch's guidance for years. Now, that's his early life though, but here's now where things really kick off. The fall of the Empire. In the year 5 ABY, the Empire finally collapsed. As we saw in Return of the Jedi, Vader sacrificed himself for Luke, Palpatine died, and the Death Star was destroyed. However, not long before this though, the Empire made a huge decision to bomb the Mandalorians' home planet, Mandalore. This horrifying event was known as the Great Purge of Mandalore and was led by an Imperial officer named Moff Gideon, whose main goal was to wipe out the Mandalorian population. Sadly though, because of this event, the Mandalorians were almost wiped out, and any survivors were just scattered throughout the galaxy trying to survive. It was heartbreaking, and at that point it seemed like the hope for the Mandalorians were doomed. As all this happened though, Din Djarin was still alive, and although he wasn't on Mandalore when all that happened, he still had to stay hidden. Many people saw Mandalorians as outsiders, even after the Empire fell. So he, along with many other Mandalorians, hid themselves on the planet Navarro and laid low there in the tunnels, that way they'd never be found. However, to stay hidden, they followed strict rules such as these. Your helmet shall never be removed in front of other living beings. If it is removed, you're not permitted to put it back on. If one is to leave the hideout, only one member is allowed to leave at a time. That way their secrecy would not be exposed. On top of these rules, this group also called themselves the Tribe and stayed there on Navarro for many years. However, in time once the Empire collapsed and things got a bit safer, Din began to start working as a bounty hunter. He flew his own personal ship, which was a Razor Crest ship, and did many jobs collecting bounties as a member of the Bounty Hunters Guild. In time, Din became one of the guild's best hunters and quickly gained a reputation for being a formidable and famous warrior. So he kept taking job after job and everything seemed to be going well for him. But then there was one job he took that changed his life. A job that would shift his entire future. The child. We jump to the year 9 ABY, which was 5 years after the Empire's collapse. At this point, Din was still working as a bounty hunter until a man named Greef Karga told him about a very dangerous but extremely high-paying job. This job was organized by a mysterious man who we know as the Client, and it's led to believe that he had some connections to what was left of the Empire. So the Client tells Din more about this job and how he wants him to retrieve a 50-year-old target. Because of the big payment, Din accepts this job and then travels to the planet Arvala 7 where he starts his search. In time, he's assisted by a farmer named Queel, who helps Din on his mission to find the target, mainly because he's so sick and tired of bounty hunters coming left and right to his home. So, Queel leads him to the target's location, and as he does, Din meets another bounty hunter who is a droid named IG-11. Although he was reluctant at first, he teams up with this droid, and they shoot down every guard in sight until they eventually reach this 50-year-old target. However, as Din approached the target, he realized that this 50-year-old was a child, Grogu. As they look at the child, IG-11 wants to eliminate him, but Din refuses and shoots down IG-11 instead, leaving the child unharmed. With that, this then begins the journey of the Mandalorian and Grogu. The Hunt. Soon after Din took Grogu, he had every intention of just returning him to the Client and calling it a day. At this point, all he cared about was his payment, and that was it really. However, on his way back to Navarro, something unexpected happened. Din and Grogu unfortunately found themselves in a rough situation where they were forced to fight up against a beast called the Mudhorn. This Mudhorn was large and pretty deadly, and so Din, being a formidable hunter, tried to take it on alone. Unfortunately though, he quickly lost, and as the Mudhorn then beat him up left and right, it looked like he was about to kill Din. That was until Grogu then used the Force to lift the Mudhorn and save Din from death. At that moment, Din was shocked because he had never seen anything like it, and although he didn't want to admit it, he kinda grew a bond with Grogu after that. However, even with that though, he still returned back to Navarro and returned the child to the Client. In time though, Din started to feel guilt after handing Grogu over, especially since he wasn't sure if they would kill him or not. So he did something extremely risky, and something that went against every bounty hunter rule. He went to go get Grogu back. So in time, he infiltrated the Client's base, killing every stormtrooper in sight and finding Grogu, who was with a doctor. This doctor was named Dr. Pershing, and surprisingly, he actually cared about Grogu's well-being. Regardless though, Din took him, but as he left, he was soon confronted by other bounty hunters and Greef Karga, who demanded that he hand over the child. Din refused though, and in time he was surrounded by every bounty hunter, and it really seemed like his story was gonna end there, until something unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, tons of his fellow Mandalorians arrived and defended Din so he could escape. This was a huge risk, since the Mandalorians had stayed hidden for years, but they were all willing to risk exposure just so Din and the child could escape unharmed. So, Din did just that, and he and Grogu lived to see another day. The Confrontation. After escaping, Din and Grogu were soon hunted by the Empire and bounty hunters. So, the two went from planet to planet, but it seemed like everywhere they went, they were being hunted and targeted. Nothing and nowhere was safe for them. Then in time, Din later received a transmission from Greef Karga, the same man who once hired him, then betrayed him. He tells him in the transmission that Navarro has changed a lot since he left and was now filled with Imperials everywhere, mainly because of the Client. Now everything had changed for the worse, and he now sees the Client as an enemy. So he offers Din one last job, to return to Navarro, use Grogu as bait, and kill the Client. If he does that, then Din won't have to worry about being hunted constantly by the Empire, and his name would also be cleared with the bounty hunters. So after hearing this, Din is skeptical, but he agrees, realizing he can't stay on the run forever. So in time, he recruits a squad to help him along the mission. Cara Dune, who was a former rebel shock trooper that he met on his travels. Queel, who previously helped him find Grogu earlier. Then finally IG-11, who Din shot down a while back, but in time, Queel eventually found his remaining parts and reprogrammed him to do good. Now, IG-11 was no longer a hunter, but instead a loyal caretaker droid. So with this crew, Din returned to Navarro and they started setting out their plan. Now at this point though, Din and Greef still didn't fully trust each other, mainly because of what happened not long ago. But then something crazy happened. Before the big mission, they camped out at night when Greef was then attacked by creatures called Minox. As a result, he was badly injured, but then Grogu used the Force to heal him, which really earned his trust. At that moment, that's when everything changed for Greef, and any thought he had earlier about betraying Din or double-crossing him went out the window. So the next day, they infiltrated their mission and Din and Greef delivered Grogu to the Client. Or at least, that's what he thought. The entire time, the crib was empty, and meanwhile Queel had Grogu all along, trying to deliver him back to the ship, that way he'd remain unharmed. However, that was until Moff Gideon arrived, and in time he learned of what was going on. So under his command, his troopers quickly caught up to Queel, then killed him and stole Grogu. As all that happened, Moff Gideon then executed the Client and his men, killing them without mercy. clearly the client failed him, so he showed no hesitation in killing him. As all that happened, Din, Greef, and Cara Dune were all trapped in the base when all hope seemed lost. Luckily though, in time, IG-11 came to the rescue and killed the troopers that stole Grogu. From there, he shot down everyone in sight, doing whatever he could to protect Grogu and the crew. From there, it became an all-out war, and Din was even heavily wounded, almost dying at one point. So in a rare act, he removed his helmet so IG-11 could treat his injuries. Now technically, Din didn't break the rules of his creed here, since IG wasn't a living being, so it works out in a way. So after that, Din and the crew were all able to escape, and as they did, they came across the armorer from earlier, who was still hiding in the tunnels. When she met with Din, they spoke about Grogu, and then she smelt a new signet onto his armor, which was a symbol of the Mudhorn. She told him that moving forward, Grogu is now his responsibility, and he must be returned to the Jedi. Din was confused at first, but in time he accepted, and so that was his new goal, to find the Jedi. So after their conversation, Din and the crew then escaped, but the armorer chose to stay behind. In time, they were all able to make it out, but sadly throughout it, IG-11 sacrificed himself so that way everyone could escape. From there, Moff Gideon and his soldiers lost, and in time, Din then set out for his new journey, to return Grogu to the Jedi. The search for the Jedi. Not long after, Din and Grogu continued their adventures, and Din began his search for the Jedi. To start, he began by first looking for other Mandalorians for help, and in time he learned of a man named Cobb Vanth, who was on Tatooine. However, Din quickly learned that Vanth wasn't a Mandalorian, but instead a marshal just wearing Mandalorian armor, once belonging to Boba Fett. This enraged Din at first, but in time, Vanth offered a deal for him. He'll give him the armor as long as Din helps him kill a deadly beast called the Krayt Dragon. At first, Din hated this idea, but in time he agreed, and eventually they were successful. They killed the Krayt Dragon, and so Din then received Boba's old armor. From there, he continued his journey in searching for the Jedi, until he eventually got his first clue. This clue came when he encountered a lady named Bo-Katan Kryze. Bo-Katan was the sister to Duchess Satine Kryze, who we spoke about earlier, who ruled Mandalore during the Clone Wars. Originally, Bo-Katan was once a part of that group called Death Watch, but later broke away and formed her own faction. In time, she eventually rose to power, and even became ruler of Mandalore, wielding what's called the Darksaber. The Darksaber was an ancient Mandalorian weapon that symbolized leadership. Whoever held it was considered the rightful leader of Mandalore. Unfortunately though, years ago, Bo-Katan lost the Darksaber to Moff Gideon when he and his empire bombed Mandalore in the Great Purge, the same one that we spoke about earlier. So, Bo-Katan only travels with a small group now, and her main goal is to hunt Moff Gideon to reclaim the Darksaber. So now when she encountered Din, the two spoke, and Din said that he's looking for a Jedi. Bo-Katan then agreed to reveal a Jedi's location to him only if Din helps her destroy an Imperial cruiser. At the moment, she was building herself a fleet to go after Moff Gideon, and this ship could be of great use to her. In time, Din accepted, and after being successful in the mission, Bo-Katan finally revealed the Jedi's location. Out on the planet of Corvus, there was a Jedi she knew well named Ahsoka Tano. For those that don't know, Ahsoka was once Anakin Skywalker's Padawan. At one point, she even fought alongside Bo-Katan, all during the Clone Wars. However, once Order 66 took place and the Empire rose to power, Ahsoka went into hiding, and as for Anakin, well, we all know what happened to him. So, Din then traveled to Corvus and eventually finds Ahsoka where he brings Grogu to her. Once the two spoke, Ahsoka finally revealed the child's name to Din, and that his name was Grogu. All this time, Din was just calling him the child, so now he actually knew his real name. Unfortunately though, as the two kept speaking, Ahsoka shared that she can't train Grogu, mainly because of his strong attachment to Din. She warned that it could lead him down a dark path, like Anakin for example. So instead, Ahsoka told him to bring Grogu to the planet of Tython. On that planet, there would be a Seeing Stone, where Grogu can sit and connect with other Jedi. If there were any Jedi nearby, they'd sense him and come for him. So, Din did just that and brought him there. But let's just say, everything was about to change for the worse. As Grogu was then meditating on the Seeing Stone, a ship arrived at the scene, and this was none other than Boba Fett himself. Boba had been tracking Din this entire time to reclaim his armor. However, in their encounter, they were soon interrupted by the Empire arriving. Tons and tons of stormtroopers arrived, and so they all worked together to defeat them. Boba even got his armor back, and they all killed every trooper left and right. Unfortunately though, Moff Gideon himself was just right above them, and just like before, he was still after Grogu. So he sent down his elite dark troopers to the surface to capture Grogu, and well, he was successful. Grogu was captured, and in time, Din's ship, the Razor Crest, was also destroyed. Now it seemed like all hope was lost, but Boba and his assassin Fennec Shand refused to leave Din's side. They both agreed that they'd do whatever had to be done to help him get Grogu back, and well, that's when things kick off. In time, they even recruit Bo-Katan and her crew, forming a large alliance. By Din recruiting Bo-Katan, it was kind of a win-win for both. Din of course wanted to get Grogu back, and Bo-Katan wanted her Darksaber back from Moff Gideon. So they all teamed up and invaded Gideon's ship, and in time, Din and Gideon entered a head-to-head duel. Eventually, Din overpowered and defeated Gideon, but as Gideon laid there defeated, he couldn't help but laugh. At first, Din was confused why he was laughing, but after turning him into Bo-Katan, it was there where Gideon revealed something crazy. See, we of course know that Bo-Katan wanted the Darksaber back, but in order to own the Darksaber, you had to win it in combat. Otherwise, it would be considered dishonorable, and you weren't worthy of wielding it. So now technically, the Darksaber belonged to Din, not Bo-Katan. However, they couldn't focus on that for much longer, because in time, an army of Gideon's Dark Troopers came to attack them to rescue Gideon. Sadly, they were all trapped in a room, and these indestructible troopers were pounding the doors to come and kill them all. That was until the unexpected happened. Out of nowhere, a singular X-Wing arrived, and within mere minutes, this mysterious person left the ship and ignited a green lightsaber, killing every droid in sight. This was a Jedi, but not just any Jedi. This was Luke Skywalker. So, Luke came in and saved the day, but even more than that, he came for Grogu. Clearly, he sensed Grogu when he was at the Seeing Stone, so now Luke was ready to take him in and train him. However, because Din was so attached to Grogu, he struggled to let him go. He knew he had to, but it was hard for him. So, he did what nobody expected him to do and removed his helmet, shedding in tears he looked at his buddy. With that, he broke the Mandalorian creed he grew up with as he said his goodbyes to Grogu. From there, Luke then took Grogu away to begin his training, and Din was heartbroken. Meanwhile, as that happened, Moff Gideon was captured and was set to go on trial, so it seemed like peace was finally restored. However, let's just say that was far from the case. The reunion. Over the months, Din continued with his own missions and spent a lot of time training with the Darksaber. However, he did struggle to wield it. In order to wield this weapon, it required a clear, focused mind, and well, that was a challenge for Din. Ever since he said goodbye to Grogu, he struggled a lot mentally and emotionally. He missed him each and every day. However, in time, Din was able to find remnants of his old Mandalorian tribe, including the armor once again. But then something happened. As he spoke to her, Din revealed that he broke the creed and admitted that he removed his helmet. So the armor then told him that now he was no longer a Mandalorian and instead was an apostate. However, she did say that there was one way he could redeem himself. To rejoin the creed, he had to bathe in the living waters that was on Mandalore. But there was one problem about this. Since Mandalore was destroyed, nobody believed these waters still existed. So, Din was now left with nothing. He no longer had Grogu, he was no longer a Mandalorian, he was broken. So, he did something unexpected. Because of everything, Din set out to reunite with Grogu. However, there was just one problem, and that was that he needed a new ship. So in time, he built himself a Naboo N1 starfighter, which were the same ones we saw in The Phantom Menace. However, he repainted his to be silver and yellow, which are the same colors as his old Razor Crest. So once he did this, Din then traveled to the planet of Ossus, where Luke was training Grogu there. As he arrived though, he was soon confronted by Ahsoka again, but she told him not to interfere at all. She mentioned that if Grogu saw him, it could ruin all his training progress, since he clearly had a strong attachment to Din. This upset Din, but he understood, so he just left the gift for Grogu instead, which was a piece of Beskar chainmail. When Luke himself eventually saw this gift, he realized that Grogu's attachment to Din was just way too strong. So he offered Grogu a choice: return to Din or continue his training as a Jedi. Of course though, Grogu chose Din, and so in time the two became reunited, never to be separated again. However, their journey together was far from over. Reclaiming Mandalore. As Din and Grogu continued their journey together, their paths reunited with the armor who was helping lead a new Mandalorian covert. As they arrived, Din spoke with the armor and in a way asked for redemption. This of course was because he removed his helmet, and technically he still wasn't accepted back as a Mandalorian yet. So she told him again that the only way to redeem himself was to bathe in the living waters on Mandalore. But that wasn't an option. Mandalore was destroyed and there was no going there. So, Din then pleaded and asked for a chance, since he believed maybe Mandalore wasn't destroyed like everyone claimed it was. If it wasn't, then he could bathe there, and he'd be allowed to be a Mandalorian once more. Although she was reluctant, in time the armor accepted this, and so Din and Grogu set course for Mandalore so he could redeem himself. Eventually the two arrived, and it turned out the planet wasn't fully destroyed or poisoned, so Din was able to reach the mines where the living waters were. However, on his way there, he was attacked by a large droid that took him and held him prisoner. From there, he was held captive, but luckily Grogu was able to escape. So, Grogu took matters into his own hands, and with the help of the droid R5-D4, they traveled to Bo-Katan for help. Although Bo-Katan couldn't understand Grogu, she saw how sad he looked and knew that he must be in trouble. In time, she learned from the droid that Din was on Mandalore, so she set out to rescue him along with Grogu. Eventually, they arrived, and after finding Din who was captured, she attacked the droid. As she did though, she found Din's Darksaber that was on the ground and used it to fight and eventually kill the droid for good. With that, Din was saved, but since technically Bo-Katan rescued him and slayed his capturer, the Darksaber belonged to her now. So now, the Darksaber would be in Bo-Katan's hands again, and within the mines, Din was able to bathe in the living waters and redeem himself. It was done. He really did it. So, after he did, he then returned back to the covert, and from there, the armor along with other Mandalorians accepted him back in. Now it seemed like everything was good again. Din was redeemed and Bo-Katan owned the Darksaber once more. However, things would quickly take a turn. In time, Bo-Katan used the Darksaber to reunite several Mandalorian clans together, and thought that it was time to reclaim their homeworld of Mandalore. Although it took a bit of time, she was able to recruit hundreds of Mandalorian soldiers spread across the galaxy, and it really seemed like the Mandalorians were one again. So, she and the others all returned to Mandalore to reclaim their planet, but as they arrived, they were met with the unexpected. Out of nowhere, they were attacked by an army of troopers of what were called Imperial Armored Commandos. These soldiers were elite stormtroopers, but had Beskar armor, jetpacks, and were trained in the Mandalorian ways. So clearly, they were hiding here all along, and were waiting for Bo-Katan and the Mandalorians to arrive. From there, they ambushed all of them, but that wasn't even the worst part. To make matters worse, during their ambush, they were even able to capture Din and take him prisoner. Sadly, Grogu witnessed all of this, and he was devastated. Then as Din was captured, he was approached by a black armored Mandalorian. Or at least, he thought it was a Mandalorian. As the man removed his helmet, it was Moff Gideon. It turns out that when Gideon was captured ages ago and was set to go on trial, his soldiers broke him out and freed him. So now, as Gideon confronted Din, he thanked him, as this was his plan all along. He wanted all the Mandalorians to all be in one place, so he could do exactly what he did all those years ago, and that was to wipe them all out. So from there, he took Din away, and now it was up to Bo-Katan, Grogu, and their army to rescue him. In time they did, and eventually we got a final confrontation between them and Gideon. During their fight though, Gideon and Bo-Katan went back and forth at one point, and Gideon was able to overpower her and crush the Darksaber. With that, the Darksaber was destroyed, and it really seemed like Gideon had won. However, in time, the other Mandalorians soon swept in and saved the day. In time, they were able to destroy the base, and Gideon died inside the fire. Luckily as that happened, Grogu used the Force to save himself, Din, and Bo-Katan, and with that, the Mandalorians had won, with Gideon finally dead. Following that, a mini ceremony was held by the Mandalorians, and one person who was honored there was Grogu. The armor shared that he's now the son of Din Djarin, and from this day forward, he'll no longer be named Grogu, but rather Din Grogu. With that, he was now Din's Mandalorian apprentice moving forward, and so the bond between the two was truly never stronger. With this victory, the Mandalorians also finally reclaimed their homeworld, and Bo-Katan became their rightful ruler, even without the Darksaber. Meanwhile, Din and Grogu finally had peace, and with Moff Gideon dead, nobody was hunting them anymore for the first time throughout their time together. So, after the victory on Mandalore, the two traveled to the planet of Delphi, where there was a New Republic base there. It was there where Din met with an officer named Carson Teva, and he told him that moving forward, he needs to be more selective with his bounty assignments. So as an offer, he suggested that he could work for the New Republic as an independent contractor, and well, Carson Teva accepted this deal. Following that meeting, Din and Grogu then returned back to their good friend Greef Karga, who is back on Navarro, and as a present for Din, Greef gives him his own home where he can just lay low and relax. So, the two did just that, and with that, that concludes the story of The Mandalorian and Grogu before their upcoming film. The Mandalorian and Grogu. Not long after these events, Din starts his work for the New Republic, along with Grogu by his side. From what we know, a New Republic officer named Colonel Ward will be hiring Din and Grogu for what seems to be a very dangerous job. While we don't know what job this is yet, we do know that it involves a Hutt named Rada the Hutt. Rada was the son of Jabba the Hutt, and we actually first saw Rada years ago as a small baby during the Clone Wars. On top of Rada, we'll also be seeing the character Zeb Orrelios appear, which if you don't know, he appeared in the animated series Star Wars Rebels and had a pretty big role. That's not all though. Within the trailers we've gotten so far, Din will also have his iconic Razor Crest ship back. Although we saw his get destroyed, many believe that this is a brand new one and he'll be taking it along with him on this deadly mission. On top of that, Grogu will also look a bit different. In the film, he'll be wearing his new Beskar shield around his chest, and from what's been shown, he seems to have grown a lot in his Force abilities. From what's been shown, the movie will be extremely action-packed, gritty, and we might even see Din and Grogu's relationship be put to the test. Luckily for you, you'll be prepared for the film, as that now concludes Din and Grogu's story as well as everything you need to know before watching The Mandalorian and Grogu. But I want to know from you, are you excited for The Mandalorian and Grogu, and what are your predictions for the film? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and may the Force be with you, always.